You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your uncertain host, Abraham.
And I am your, host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all the things that we do as humans and all the fun stuff like that, and also sometimes animals and that sort of thing. We just finished up our series on spooky-themed Halloween episodes. So we're now doing a return to form here in our sort of normal pattern of episodes. And for this one, I decided it would be fun to look at some body language.
And not like scary body language, nice and wholesome body language. I feel like this is probably arguably one of the most wholesome things that we do. It is so like just innocent and unassuming and not violent at all. It's great. I love it.
Fair enough. So yeah, we are talking about this gesture that we do as humans, where we sort of raise our shoulders up, and I don't know, uncertain. It seems to be what it's communicating without words, and we're so familiar with it. This is the shrug, when we shrug.
Yeah.
I had to think, this is not a behavior that we just do biologically as a form of communication, meaning that we're not genetically programmed to communicate with a shrug explicitly, but nevertheless, we do it a lot, right? It's a very easy thing that people learn. And so it had me wondering sort of what's the history of this? Why do people shrug?
So, what's really great about this one is this year I read the entire Animorph series, and one of the things they talk about, the one alien that's part of their group that picks up human gestures, they pick up nodding and they pick up shrugs. They're like, they didn't nod or they didn't shrug before, and then like the longer they hung out with humans, they started nodding and shrugging, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing.
Wow, that's cool. That's cool they thought about that.
Yeah, it's all very 90s and it's very ridiculous, but there is at the very least there's like that subtle detail where you're like, okay, cool.
That's fun. I like that.
Yeah.
Also, Shane, this episode comes out on November 2nd.
Yay!
We're now into November. There's a lot of things going on this November that everyone is probably well attuned to, and we'll speak to a little bit of that. But given the time of season that it is and all the things that are going to be going on here very shortly, I'd like to let everyone know that today is National Stress Awareness Day.
Oh, good. I'm very aware of my own stress, so this is great.
Yes, you do seem like you're particularly well attuned to your own level of stress already. But another one that I like, that I think you'll also like, is that today is Dynamic Harmlessness Day.
Yay! I like that, whatever that means. That's a lot of fancy words.
Yeah. We have some potentially conflicting holidays today, depending on how you like to celebrate and how you orient to the world. But it is Eating Healthy Day.
Okay.
And also National Deviled Egg Day.
I like both of those things, I guess.
Yeah. Does it work? I don't know.
Can you hold two conflicting ideas together at the same time? The idea of duality is in today.
Yes, that's fair. Couple other monthly celebrations I'm going to point out. We have some really good ones here I'm excited about. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a couple this time, a couple next time. It looks like for the month of November, we have 9. So let's cover a few of those now. One is that it is Movember. This is one of the more well-known, I think, November month type holidays. So this is No Shave November.
Yes. That's No Shave November. Come on. We've been living Octobeard, Septembeard. So, Novembeard and No Shave November is just a continuation for me.
Yeah, that's fair. And it is also National Peanut Butter Lovers Month, which so in support of.
Hell yeah. That is the theme of the show.
It is sometimes. There are plenty more others to share. The last one I'll share is that this is World Vegan Month.
Yeah.
So,
hey,
how about that?
Does not match with Deviled Egg Day.
No, but it could line up with Eating Healthy Day potentially. It's pretty easy to eat unhealthy and be vegan anymore, but that's the thing.
It's good stuff.
Oh, also, by the way, it's Marzipan Week.
Okay. All right, there's that too. I love that there's days, weeks, and months.
Yeah.
Whatever tickles your fancy.
All kinds of ways to celebrate. Well,
Yeah.
Despite what you might think, this is not an episode or a podcast about calendars or holidays, but in fact, we are talking about psychology things. As we move forward into our topic, I'll just let everyone know up front that if you like our show and you like to support us and you aren't already doing that thing, then you can go out and leave us a rating and review, subscribe, tell a friend. You can write why we do what we do on your name badge next time you're at like a thing where you have a sticker that has your name on it. You can also pick up some merch from our store. And I'll talk more about all of those things at the end of this discussion. And I think that's all I have before we actually get to dive into our topic.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we should talk about this thing that we do with our shoulders.
We should. So as I said, the question of is shrug a gesture that is something that's explicitly taught? We'll answer that question. And what is the message being conveyed when you're shrugging? Is this international? Like, do all people shrug as just part of a natural symbol of communication that humans do, much like smiling? And, how do we use this thing?
We're also going to answer the question about whether or not people who are visually impaired, who can't see this behavior occur, if they shrug. And we're also going to answer a strange question that feels like it's out of left field. Is Darwin the original mentalist?
It's a great question.
Yeah. So, bet you didn't see that one coming.
Nope, you wouldn't.
Shrug and the origin of the species.
That means that we're giving away, we're sort of teasing upcoming topics here.
Yeah. So let's go ahead. I think just like every other episode, we should start with a definition, right? I think a definition is a good place to begin.
Sure. In case you've never been around humans and you're not aware of what we mean when we say shrug, the definition of a shrug is to raise or draw in the shoulders, especially to express aloofness, indifference, or uncertainty. So you can imagine essentially just as you're standing, you just raise those shoulders up. If you're watching the video of us doing this, you can see us doing it right now. Yeah, it's like you're trying to shrink your neck down into your shoulders or something.
Yeah.
But mostly, rather than going with your head and neck going down, your shoulders are coming up.
I see some people do lower their head and then they also raise their hands too. They kind of go, huh.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, a common expression of the shrug is the hands up in the air, like palms up, hands up, usually arms out in sort of a W formation, if you will, across your body and shoulders up.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty clear, that's about as clear as you can make it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this can convey uncertainty and submissiveness and has been seen in a wide range of contexts in regard to human interactions. It could be used in flirting, it could be used in greetings, it could be used in arguments, and even friendly conversations. It's one of those generalizable skills that works in a lot of different spaces.
It can also happen fairly quickly. It can just be a quick, they pop up and come back down. And that also is sending a different version of that message. They're all sending a message, and how you do that message, I think, communicates different things. So it's not even a singular message that happens, because you can add accents and emphasis and speed and all of that. So when we're trying to define a shrug in such a way that you can clearly observe it, that definition can vary because of those manifestations that I just described. We have lots of scalability in the issues surrounding how you communicate the shrug. So to say this is a shrug or is not a shrug is actually difficult, because it could span quite a range of possible gestures.
And so we can ask some questions like this. Do shoulders have to be involved in a shrug? Do the hands and arms have to be up, or can it just be the shoulders? And we've seen versions of both of those things that could be technically defined as a shrug.
Yeah, another one that can happen sometimes is a head tilt. Is it necessary? Mm-hmm. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or what if someone just raises their eyebrows and their mouth? The one you can sort of just look up, raise your eyebrows, I think is probably a somewhat similar gesture, but often will accompany a shrug.
Yeah, I guess it's helpful for people who maybe can't shrug or don't have shoulders.
Or are restrained in such a way that they can't use it. Yeah. Which I think you kind of said when you said they can't shrug.
Yeah, there's lots of different reasons why somebody can't shrug. So I guess maybe the thing it comes down to is the answer to all those questions is if we all just use the shrug emoji as an exemplar, then we don't even have to shrug anymore. We could just use that one and we're good, right? Problem solved.
Shane just flirted with me with his eyebrows, by the way, everybody.
That's true. That's accurate.
So with all these variations in the gesture and how it can appear and the way, things it may or may not include that make it difficult to pin down, and the way that we're talking about, this sort of raises a level of ambiguity, and that also then implies maybe this isn't that universal of a gesture after all, and this expression. So can you really know what someone's trying to convey without additional context clues just by using their shrug sort of gesture, and maybe not?
Right. And so an example here would be if you consider the word sure, right? We use the word sure, at least in the United States, and the context is needed to convey the meaning. So maybe your friend texts you and says, "Can you help me move on Saturday?" And your response is, "Sure." No emojis, no exclamation points. And are they saying, "Sure, I guess I will do it," but they don't really want to? Or are they saying, "Sure, I would love to. Super stoked you finally found a house in this crazy market"? It could be one or the other. There's a lot of kind of context clues that might be missing in that singular phrase.
Or similarly, maybe your partner asks you, "Are you still mad?" And you respond by shrugging while thinking to yourself, "Of course I am." All while your partner has to wonder if you're being passive aggressive or truly communicating the state of your feelings and thinking, well, they didn't say anything explicit, so maybe they're just getting over it or something. In that case, the shrug communicates relatively little. Almost what it's communicating is a sense of ambiguity. And that's all that I'm sending your way is a ... question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, is like just something that simple can make communication so complex. And so this leads to eventually we're going to ask the question, and we have to ask the question of whether or not people have tried to explain this or research this. But before we do that, there might be some ads. I don't know.
All right, Shane. Now, I'm given to understand some experts have attempted to weigh in on this topic, including us, or maybe not including us. We're not experts, so.
We're not quite the experts, but there is at least one person that I feel like is maybe an expert on just kind of living organisms, and that would be Darwin. Darwin was the first person to actually explore what the shrug was, and in his book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and the Animals, published in 1872, Darwin proposed three main principles based on his observations that could aid in the explanation of human and animal expressive acts. For example, fear, horror, shyness, surprise, anger, and stuff like that. What he proposed were principles, and these principles are, quote, the principle of serviceable associated habits, end quote. There is also, quote, the principle of antithesis, end quote, and, quote, the principle of actions due to the constitution of the nervous system independently from the first of the will and independently to a certain extent of habit, end quote. That last one just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Oh, it's catchy.
So yeah, I mean, that's the name of my new band.
Right.
Super easy to look up on Spotify.
Maybe that should be the name of this episode.
Yeah.
So Darwin stated that all bodily expressions serve a function in some point. And I think to that point, I generally agree with him. So for example, when a dog is threatened, a common thing that you'll expect to see is that their hackles are raised. They look bigger and are ready to confront the threat. And so that's sort of a bodily expression that they will do.
Could you imagine if a shrug was a more threatening act? Like you raise your shoulders and it's like, eh. Like, I mean, I guess if you make certain noises with it, like if I shrug and I go, eh, like it looks creepy, and it probably is pretty threatening.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends. It's shrug plus, right?
I would be amused by a character in a show who, like, to be intimidated, shrugged. And they kind of went at you, with their like looking like uncertain at what they're doing. It's funny. They're like, I'm trying to rewrite all of human history with this bodily gesture.
I think maybe that's also a carryover effect from our Halloween episodes that we're thinking of spooky, scary. So like we're just trying to think of other things that are maybe scary.
Good point.
Now, what Darwin did propose was that shrugging can be explained from one of his three principles. Specifically the principle of antithesis that aided in explaining animals' expressive acts like smiling, nodding, and shrugging. So that was part of that specific principle of his.
So hopefully you're wondering, as I'm wondering at this time, in this part of the conversation, what is the principle of antithesis? Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like that title doesn't feel like it communicates very clearly what it might be in reference to. So let's just take Darwin's words here. So Darwin said, quote, certain states of mind lead to certain habitual actions as under our first principle. Now, when a directly opposite state of mind is induced, there's a strong and involuntary tendency to the performance of movements of a directly opposite nature, end quote. Page 34 from whatever text this is. As he notes, this involuntary tendency is present even if such opposing movements are not themselves functional.
Interesting. Okay. So Darwin provides a model of this explanation in the form of an illustration. Sorry, listeners, you can't see this, but we will try to link and share this. We'll end up putting it on our social media as well, so you can see this, because it's a really great kind of photo. And so he includes this illustration to explain how shrugging can be explained by his principle of antithesis.
We'll post these as part of this episode, because you won't be able to obviously see them while listening unless you have some magic ability, in which case please write in and let me know what that is and how you use it. But what I'm looking at here is we have a picture of this very old-timey picture of a man who has a giant mutton chop beard going on. Uh-huh. He's kind of also got a skullet, happening.
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
Yes, he does.
There's two pictures of him. On one picture on the left, you have this pugilistic posture that he's in, or this aggressive posture. His head and his body are erect. His brows are furrowed. Both of his hands appear straight. He's holding them about 6 inches from his body in a downward fashion with his fists clenched. And so behaviorally, this is an example of how someone might look when they're in an aggressive state, this sort of rigid, erect stance. Although, to be fair, when I first saw the picture, I thought this was someone who was preparing to sing a solo number on Broadway, largely due to how his mouth is oriented and the fact that his chest is puffed out. But it struck me as someone about to sing.
Yeah. I mean, I also see this as like somebody who is like making a really emotional point about something. You ever see a kid that like starts to throw a tantrum and they stomp their foot and they go, I don't want to do it. Like the end part where they go, I don't want to. And they put they lock their elbows and they have their fists to their side and they're like pouting. He kind of looks like that too.
Yeah. I can see that.
Out of context, there could be any number of things. Now, in the picture on the right, when we'll share this and you'll see what we mean, in the picture on the right, it shows the same man, which is not Darwin. Head and body are not erect. His head is actually slightly tilted to one side. His shoulders and arms are raised and his arms are bent at the elbows, perpendicular to his body. So he's kind of got like a semi-right angle going on across like his upper arm and lower arms where his elbow is. His hands are open and the palms are pointed to the ceiling, right? So he's kind of like, like you would imagine what that noise sounds like when you are doing this. And so by Darwin's explanation, this pose is the exact opposite of what we might exhibit when we are in an aggressive state. And so as we mentioned, depending on the function of the quote unquote shrug, whatever it's serving, Darwin alludes that we are in a submissive state when we shrug, perhaps since we don't know the answer or how to respond. We want to kind of make a note here. Darwin alludes to the mind-body connection here, which was a pretty pervasive kind of theory or thought around early psychology and philosophy discussions. And so it makes sense that this would kind of crop up here in this discussion. But he's alluding to the idea of like your state of mind produces habitual actions.
Exactly. And so let's try and make sure we're unpacking this clearly, because I feel like all of this is a little confusing to sort of wrap your head around what he's trying to say. And I think the way that I would try and frame this, and please feel free to jump in if you feel like maybe there's a different way to capture it or way to clarify what I'm saying here. But essentially, it seems like Darwin conceptualized these gestures as being on a not even kind of a spectrum, but like kind of on a linear progression of one thing and then the opposite of that thing.
Yeah.
So for him, he had like, if we have a gesture of anger, that is the opposite in Darwin's mind of the opposite of uncertainty or submissiveness. Okay.
Right.
And his argument essentially is because those emotions are opposite, the physical habits of embodying those emotions are also opposites.
Right.
So he's essentially saying, making many leaps in my opinion, but he's saying that if anger and aggressiveness is rigidity and erectness and your brows are furrowed and your fists are clenched, then the opposite of that, which is that submissive uncertainty, is your head is lowered and to the side, your palms are up, your eyebrows are raised, all of those sorts of things. So essentially he's making the argument that your physical gestures will be the opposite of one another because the associated emotional states are the opposite of one another.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
That's pretty much what I understand of that. If I'm talking to a kindergarten class, that's how I would explain it.
Okay. I think there's obviously some things to unpack inside of that in terms of how I would critique that point of view. One is that there's no reason in my mind to believe that anger and submissiveness are opposite things. Like, they certainly don't have to be the same, but they also exist on a very complex spectrum of human emotions where you don't have anger on one side and submissive uncertainty on the other. I think there's a wide matrix of possible ways you could arrange the very idea of emotions,
Sure,
where those things could have some amount of overlap or not. So I think that part is problematic. I also don't think that to say that you're standing erect and have your arms out is the opposite of having your arms bent. They're different. Sure.
yeah,
But the opposite doesn't make sense to me. Again, why you need to place those gestures on a linear progression of opposites. Like you have one thing over here and the opposite of that thing is this over here. It just seems kind of silly and pointless. So I do see what he's trying to say, like essentially because they're communicating such different things, they move in different directions. But to try and categorize those as being opposites, I think offers very little in a way of useful analysis and understanding how and why it takes place. But, this is the 1870s. He's trying, I guess.
yeah. I mean, and so basically what we're saying is we're smarter than Darwin.
We definitely have more information than he did at the time that he was writing this.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, basically, that's what it is. It's like we understand more about the world, and that's how science works. And that's the beauty of science. It's like we know more about the world today than he had access to. But he was on a path to discover and describe some things that people were not describing. I mean, Skinner did a lot of the same stuff too in behavior analysis. He was talking about things from a behavior analytic view that nobody else was really talking about, and it actually led to a lot of interesting theories and studies and kind of tests and new hypotheses.
Right.
He's not exclaiming, this is the truth. He's saying, here's a theory about this. Go test it, world. Now, David Gibbons' paper, The Big and the Small, from 1986, further reinforced Darwin's theory that shrugging is an innate human act, and it's actually not learned, that we are not conscious of this specific behavior. And cited from his book, this is a direct quote from Gibbons' book, The Big and the Small. Quote, when people cannot answer a question or cannot perform as expected, they shrug and thereby seem, quote, small. To appease, in effect, a person becomes minimal and mere by symbolically, quote, crouching. And that's on page 157 of The Big and the Small. Now, I have specific gripes with that.
Yeah, me too.
Specifically because answering a question is not an innate thing. Right? We have to learn to answer a question because language is learned. So if we cannot perform as expected, which is also a learned expectation, we shrug in the presence of learned contexts. So language is learned. Expectations are learned. Shrugging occurring in the context of a learned expectation or verbal behavior would tell me that shrugging is learned and not innate, and that maybe it's habitual. Maybe we're so fluent in shrugging that we don't notice it, but it is something that we do in relation to learned contexts.
I love that, and I agree with you. And that's different even from what I was finding as a gripe. The leap that people make in these old sort of psychological hypotheses that they would throw out just randomly and then write books about it and build a career on it, as they did.
Jordan Peterson.
Such as this one. They do it to appear small. I'm like, everybody?
All of them?
Why? Yeah, and how do you know that? To me, that seems I have a conclusion, now I want to fit the data to fit my conclusion type of thing. And again, we have this, they become minimal and mere by symbolically crouching. I'm like, where are you getting all of this? You're literally just making things up to have an answer to something rather than really doing the investigating. And so all of that stuff bothers me, but I also agree with you that he's missing an important point by failing to consider the fact that communication is definitely learned. Because if I were to say something to you in Mandarin, I wouldn't expect you to react to it in a way that had anything to do with the language that I spoke to you, because you wouldn't understand it. So you couldn't possibly react to it in a way other than why you just said a bunch of noises at me. I don't know what they mean.
Right.
How could you have an unlearned, uncertain response or an unlearned make yourself appear small response? Okay, so moving on, we also have Adam Kendon from 2004 and Jürgen Streeck of 2009, both writing papers who believed in more of a bodily metaphor that signified more of a withdrawal from an action or some kind of affair. Their concentration was more on the specific behaviors of shrug versus the full body shrug that Darwin was talking about. So they theorized that the raising of the shoulders and the lifting of the shoulders can convey disengagement.
Now, Camille Debris, their paper on the shrug in 2017 was an empirical study on shrugging, which I love. Can we talk for a second, just real quick, about the fact that there are like research grants, and there are people that get like money to go research what shrugs are. Like they get to do they get to write papers and like publish papers and do empirical studies on shrugs. I think that's there are corners of the world that I'm just really fascinated by. And that's one of them, is like what people choose to research, what people end up researching, what people like, what questions. I love that. Like, to me, that's genuinely fascinating. I mean, that's the entire thesis of the podcast is like it's going into that. But I think it's genuinely fascinating. So Camille Debris actually wrote a paper on the shrug, and it's an empirical study. Now, what they tried to do was to see if different components of shrugging could infer different meanings. Super cool, actually, I think.
Yeah, and actually more in line with sort of the things that I think we wanted to unpack anyway in the discussion about when we were trying to define a shrug in the first place and what it is.
Yeah.
And I actually just shrugged as I was making that statement. So I think, again, different types of communication.
Yeah.
And so anyway, in her paper, she described in the results that a mouth shrug pattern with the expression of indetermination. I don't see a description of what that looked like, but I can kind of imagine like a sort of a semi-frown sort of thing, maybe being the mouth shrug.
That's how I would assume that, because if you would assume the same definition of what a shrug is, where you're lifting part of your body, like a mouth shrug would just be a smile if you're going by those old definitions, or like a form of right. So technically, like a mouth shrug would be like a okay. Like you almost like you like the corners of your mouth go down and like you almost like jut your chin out a little bit. Like,
right.
Okay. Like that's kind of what like exactly. I would, and you just kind of like non-committal. You just go, all right, sure.
We're having to describe a lot of physical gestures on this discussion.
Yeah, I didn't think we would have to do that. So, I mean, it's fine. We're making it work. Another one they talked about was that forearms, if your forearms are supine, essentially facing up, or your palms are facing up. I teach PCM, and so like I always hear that one song. It's like face down, ass up. Like so, I always hear that, and I always say face down, palms up, and I'm like, as I kind of talk about that. So supine is facing up.
Isn't that Puddle of Mud?
I hope not. So that'd be a real weird song. And why would you bring up Puddle of Mud? That's just like totally so upsetting. I don't think I've ever been so upset on this show. That's the most upsetting thing. I feel like we talked about some really gruesome things. We talked about lobotomies on this show, and the most upsetting thing that you have ever said on the show was just Puddle of Mud.
You'd think we were still in Halloween territory with that comment.
For a real good laugh, everybody should go watch that Puddle of Mud Nirvana cover when they cover About a Girl. It's really, really great.
I actually think I know exactly what song you're talking about, and I think I like just tremendously insulted a band I really like by thinking that was, or by referencing Puddle of Mud. But I'll tell you off the mic.
Yeah, I can't wait. So forearms supine, possibly supplemented by palms facing up or lateral, and this is related to the expression of incapacity or inaction. Just kind of like, I'm not getting my hands dirty, my hands are clean, I'm free of it. You're kind of like, yeah, no thanks. Kind of one of those things.
There are also multi-component shrugs, not unlike what Darwin described, linked to the expression of affect. So, for example, indifference or rejection, which suggests that more emotional uses of shrugging rely on a maybe more full or more emphatic realization of the gesture, using more body parts in more exaggerated ways.
Yeah. What they say in the paper is this, though. But, quote, conversely, the more abstract expression of common ground is not related to any specific form and can be expressed with a variety of shrug variants, end quote. So basically, can we really know? That's the question that is like the most philosophical question in general. But can we really know what's going on here? It's very difficult to tell.
And before we talk about one more study, should we take an ad break? Okay, we're back. Let's talk about one more of we actually have more studies to talk about, but one that I wanted to tackle was by Cooper Ryder and colleagues in 2018.
What a great name.
I know, right? That makes me think of, well, if I'm thinking about a Cooper as someone who makes barrels, it actually reminds me of the Hobbit movie where they were cartoonishly writing barrels down the river.
Yes. Also, I was today years old when I learned that Cooper was somebody who makes barrels. So thank you for that information.
Oh, yeah. Great. That's fun.
Yeah. Had no idea.
I went way off the rails in this, but that was fun. So yeah, in this paper, Cooper Ryder explores the palm up puzzle, in quotes, to trying to differentiate between different expressions of the palm up presentational and palm up epistemic. Those are italicized. This article mentions shrugging often and states that the palm up epistemic, that is just using your hands in an open fashion to show uncertainty, can be interchangeable with a shoulder shrug. So you can do one or the other, just raising your shoulders to show uncertainty or putting your palms up to show uncertainty. And so there's like different ways of communicating the same thing, I guess.
I like the idea of mixing and matching that, where maybe you raise one shoulder and use the opposite hand. You're like kind of like, like that. Like it's a weird, like I like the idea of mixing and matching that.
Yeah, it looks like you're sort of presenting something.
Yeah, like I'm holding a tray of like champagne flutes.
Yeah, and lifting your other shoulder for effect.
Yeah, you're like, want one? Like that.
I imagine our listeners are trying. They're trying it out. They're raising one shoulder and putting out the opposite hand.
I hope they are
seeing how they look. I hope so too.
I love stimulus control. That's my favorite. So hopefully you did that. Let us. Will you please write to us and let us know whether you did or did not do that? We don't need any more information. I just want to know whether you did that.
I wouldn't mind some like pictures of trying out different shrugs.
Yeah, I like messing around. If you have been listening to the show and you have been trying different shrugs, please let us know.
I do feel like with this one, I feel like I would have a hard time feeling like I was communicating my message effectively if I just put my palms up, unless like my hands were actually raised. As long as my hands are raised and palms up, I feel like communicating. But if I was just like sitting down and I just kind of flipped them over, I'm not sure that I feel like I was communicating very effectively with that motion. But yeah, maybe I am. Maybe I rely on it a lot.
Well, I think of like if I were to raise my hand, like it just palm up. Like if I put my hand, like to me that wouldn't signal uncertainty. That would be like, look at this. Like to me, that's the way that I would interpret that. If you just held up your hand, you're like that. You're like, see, like that's the way that I would interpret that hand gesture.
So yeah, I feel like I would be interpreting it as someone asking for something. You'd be like, put the thing in my hand. Zzz.
And I think if I held my hand out longer, I think maybe I would. But I think I just went like,
yeah.
Like I think that to me would be. But then I just realized I just like tilted my head when I did that. So I guess it really depends on the combination. It's the variance. It's always the variance.
Those Loki variants.
Oh.
If you held out your hand that way, I would probably give you a low 5.
I'd be down for that.
All right. One of the questions we billboarded at the top of this that I think is very relevant is thinking about if someone is born with a visual impairment, they are not ever observing shrugging, do they still use shrugs? So we have this Sharkey and colleagues 2000 paper here that states that visually impaired people use 50% fewer gestures than sighted people. So then the short answer is sometimes they do still use these gestures, which is kind of interesting, but to a much lesser degree than others would. Basically, it sounds like what they did is code some gestures. They were looking at people's gestures and coded them. Visually impaired people used 1,221 of the gestures coded. That was 33% out of almost 4,000 people, it looks like. And then the sighted people used 2,368. So that was 66% of the gestures coded. So that's why I think where they got that number of about 50%, because half of the visually impaired people use the gestures and 2/3 of the sighted people use those gestures. Make sense?
Yeah, so far.
Okay. So they use Bandura's social learning theory to explain the possible reason why people who are visually impaired do not use as many gestures. For example, not having access to modeling of gestures and a lack of response consequences.
Yeah, and so while the study itself didn't explicitly talk about shrugging, it was still interesting to talk about just physical gestures that without models and without different kind of imitation opportunities that folks who are visually impaired are less likely to engage in a lot of those behaviors. And so, we can get into the ideas of like specifically like how those behaviors are modeled and how they contact rewards when they are modeled through social rewards and stuff like that, or they can get punished as a result of maybe engaging in the wrong type of behavior in that context. There's a lot of behavioral kind of elements to that, but really to me, the core element of that is that there's a model that allows you to imitate and get reinforced through social interactions.
So to bring it back around to Darwin, he did try and survey, essentially, do some empirical surveying of other people around the world to study the human expressions, and was disseminating these surveys to missionaries and other travelers because he wanted to take note on these gestures and see how common they were around the world and if people engaged in the same types of gestures. And to skip to the ending, the TLDR, too long didn't read, they do. There's a lot of commonality in the gestures that people use around the world.
Mm-hmm. It's very common. It's widely used. I kind of like that. Now, some interesting things, some other views. Darwin's link between emotion and an animal's observable, objective, and measurable behavior is a very behavioral thing. And so that begs the question, is Darwin the original mentalist? Is he one of the first people to really study psychology and mentalisms and stuff like that? We know that there's a lot of folks that studied the philosophy of the mind and how that came about, and that was much, much older than Darwin. But this idea of kind of an empirical study at his time was a fairly novel practice. It was not a thing that people were doing very consistently as far as like mentalisms and psychology and that type of stuff. So he may have been one of the very first people to do this in a really meaningful way.
Yeah. Although generally when we're talking about mentalist, we're not meaning it in a flattering way.
Yes, exactly.
This is not going to come as a surprise to most people who listen to this, but when we're talking about mentalist, we're not referring to mentalist as a magician and the kind of magic trick. We're mostly talking about people who, as I actually said earlier, essentially will just come up with conclusions, their hypotheses at best, most of the time,
right,
to essentially plug in their own ideas about the causes of things that happen and the causes of behavior that depend on unseen, unobservable, unexplained, completely hypothetical variables that to them they're like, this must be the thing. Not even might be, it must be now because I want it to be because I said so, and that means I'm right and I'm smart and I have a degree, so leave me alone. I think Darwin had a lot of useful things to say, and I think he made some very awesome observations and generally oriented to things in an empirical way. And as the black box of human behavior to him was quite a mystery, though, and so he wasn't sure how to orient to that.
Yeah, that's completely reasonable.
Now, shrugging can look a lot of different ways, as we mentioned, but using just general, observable, objective, and measurable definitions, that can help in how we define what a shrug is, which can be idiosyncratic or even somewhat general. The scalability of the gesture, because it can look so many different ways, be emphasized in so many different ways, it can lead to a lot of possible descriptions and definitions of what it could possibly be. So I think as far as what I would unpack with the shrug is essentially there is some gesture. I actually think this makes a lot of sense if you think about the generality of this around the world, that people use some kind of shrug gesture or something like it. But there's also a lot a variation in how it looks, which essentially means that generally it seems like people have developed a way of gesturing a level of uncertainty, right?
Yep.
For some, that is raising the shoulders. For some, it's palms up. For some, it's raised eyebrows. For some, it's a frown. For some, it's a combination of some of those things. For some, it's maybe one shoulder. There might be different ways. That's relatively general. We do see in a lot of different cultures, and it does make sense. We do more or less have a mostly global culture at this point in some capacity. At least we can interact with people. But I also think there's something about it where, without being able to understand exactly the nuances of the circumstance under which this gesture arose, I imagine it's been a useful way of communicating for a very long time in human history.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense.
And so, unfortunately, it puts us in a position of having to speculate a little bit. But I think understanding that if there is a useful symbolic level of body language communication, much like a smile. So it's another one where we've talked about that smile seems to be pretty universal. Everywhere we've looked in the world, the smile seems to mean about the same thing. I imagine there's a few gestures, and the shrug being one of them, where you look around the world and you see it means a relatively similar thing in the various ways that it's performed. So it's probably been with us a very long time, something that we've modeled and practiced to the point where it does look somewhat habitual, but it is something that we still learn. We learn the context to use it, and we learn different ways to use it. And I'll say for myself, I tend to go with a very quick little shrug. as the way that I like to communicate. And mine basically says, I'm not sure. Like, that's essentially what I'm trying to communicate with that. It usually is accompanied by words. I don't usually just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But that is, I think, how I tend to use it. But I think if I do go the full exaggerated, like hands in the air, head tilt, eyebrows raised, mouth in the frown, shoulders are up, the whole thing, I'm really trying to say, I have not the faintest clue or opinion or like way of contributing to this. I'm at a total loss as saying a lot more than just I don't really know or I don't really care. With a quick shrug, I'm communicating a lot more emphatically that I don't know, the more exaggerated my gesture is.
Yeah, I think for me, the more exaggerated my gesture is, you can usually tell how frustrated I am. Like, if I'm throwing my hands up, I'm like, come on! Like, that's usually like my shrug is that. It's not like, I don't know. I'm like, it's usually like, what the hell is happening right now? That's usually what that means.
Yeah. And I think the head tilt eyebrow raise for me, I'm usually mean more to say like, maybe?
Yeah.
Than I am saying, I don't know. So I feel like I use mine in very specific ways. And I'd be willing to bet that, again, if you survey people around the world, you're going to find that not only is the gesture itself something that's somewhat general, but the way that people use it is actually going to be kind of different. Like, all of them are some level of maybe or uncertainty or acquiescence, but they actually are not even being used in exactly the same way. They're being used to communicate. How they communicate is going to be cultural. It's going to be individual. It's going to be learned.
100%. Absolutely. Well, as Abraham said, he would bet on it. So while everybody places their bets, we're going to take an ad break.
If you bet on my hypothesis, you all just won.
100%.
We have a few more things before we tie this up. Did you know that Darwin's book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and the Animals in 1872 was one of the first book to use illustrations?
I did not know that. That was actually a really fun tidbit that Jess found for the show.
Yeah. Great find. Interestingly, apparently, his publisher advised against it, citing that it would specifically poke a hole in the profits and why they should not use illustrations. Darwin was like, no, this is the future, sir.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, working in publishing, yes, that's true. But I think the thing is it's not as much as people think it is. And people like pictures. So, I mean, just all you got to do is just pay attention to like the fact that Instagram exists, right? The whole reason that works as a social network is because people like pictures.
Yeah. Can you imagine? I think that we would not have had Dr. Seuss if we hadn't had Darwin.
You know, it all makes sense. It all links. It all works.
There's another reason the bigot mob on the right wants to cancel Dr. Seuss.
Because of pictures? Or because of Darwin?
Because of pictures, because of Darwin.
Because Dr. Seuss is related to Darwin, and there's an evolutionary subtext underneath it. I get it.
Yep. It was a stretch, but I got us there through a series of abstractly related ideas.
Oh, I love derived relations. It's so great.
Indeed. We have some take-home points, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I think the first one is we're not quite sure that we can actually surmise why we shrug, but we do have some interesting theories behind it. So I think that's my favorite thing is like this thing that we do that is pretty universal. We still don't really know why it happens. We can make some pretty good guesses through a behavioral lens. It makes sense that there's a social norm related to it. It's a form of communication and that there's a model for it for folks that can see this actually happening. So I think that there's some really cool things there, but we still don't really know why Shrug showed up.
There's an interesting take-home point here, I think, that people have been interested in this gesture for over 100 years.
Yeah.
150 years, actually, if we consider Darwin to be one of the first to talk about this. Research is ongoing. Jess was able to find research up to 2017, and there probably is some that have even happened since then. And so I think it is an interesting thing that this relatively universal gesture is one that we're still talking about and trying to unpack. And I think because it's fascinating that we communicate so effectively without language in such a relatively general way across many different cultures in the world. Again, it's one of those topics that I think isn't such in the sweet spot for us as a podcast, because it's one of those things where like, why are you talking about shrugging? Like,
right.
Who cares? And it's because I feel like it's on the surface feels inane, but if you start to really think about it, it actually does raise a lot of questions and sort of makes you think. So it's almost like the Ig Nobel prizes in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it, right? Like it's a pretty harmless thing. It's an interesting thing. Most everybody can relate to doing it, and now we've just oriented your thought and some of your behavior towards how you shrug, why you shrug, when you shrug, what context in which, like, what are the contexts in which you shrug more often? Like, I think that there's like a really cool thing to unpack within that.
And I will say, I think another important take home here is that the interpretations of the shrug and the data that have been used relied a lot on subjectivity, more than I would generally be comfortable with. And so to state conclusively what a person is conveying without them stating what they're conveying does not seem like it's very scientifically sound, not like you'd be able to derive conclusively any meaning from that. And I think just surveying the two of us who grew up natively speaking English, American English, albeit in different parts of the country, using shrugs in similar, albeit different ways, communicates, I think, or at least demonstrates the fact that these gestures, while they have some commonality, are still going to be relatively idiosyncratic, which again makes a lot of sense. There's something about it that's useful, but how it's used varies across cultures and throughout time. And so there was something effective about gestured communication that has spanned a lot of human culture and history, but it's going to develop very idiosyncratically within the culture in which one person finds themselves.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's like a perfect take-home point. I've got nothing else on that.
For the win, the perfect take-home point. Do I get a trophy?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Thanks. All right. Well, I think that's what we have about shrugging. I'd like to specifically start by thanking Jess for putting together the notes on these. She did a great job helping us with this one.
So cool.
Yeah, super fun and did a good job. So let's transition to some recommendations.
Recommendations. Recommendations. Okay, so as anybody who listens to the show knows, I'm just like a music dork. Like I will consume so much music. I listen to, genuinely hours of music every single day.
Yeah.
Like nonstop. From the time that I will listen to 8-10 hours of music if I can per day. Like I just listen to so much. Well,
Shane is listening to music while we record. It's like playing through his headphones while he's speaking.
I've thought about it. I wanted to see if I could. So there is a band that I really enjoy. They're a 90s band. They were an alternative band that was like kind of weird. They're called Archers of Loaf, and they got really famous.
Interesting.
They were pretty popular in the 90s, but they got even more famous when the hardcore band American Nightmare did a cover of You and Me on one of their like weird EPs, and then a bunch of hardcore kids were like, "Oh, Archers of Loaf is so cool," myself included. Like I totally got sucked in, but I actually like Archers of Loaf more than American Nightmare now. Anyway, my point is, Archers of Loaf broke up. They were not around by the time I got into them. Then they got back together, and they just recently released a new album called Reason in Decline, and it is really good, and it is really weird, and I really like it. So if you get a chance to check it out, this is probably arguably their most normal record.
Okay.
So go check it out. Reason in Decline is good. Icky Metal is good, which is their first full length, but this one is a really good record to go check out.
Sorry, did you say what kind of music this was, like genre-wise?
I would say it's like kind of like noisy alternative. Like if you like stuff like Dinosaur Jr., if you like stuff like that's kind of got like a little bit of an indie rock feel to it, but it's got kind of a grunge feel to it, that's the sound I would say. It's like definitely got indie and grunge kind of mixed in together. It feels very 90s alternative when you listen to it, but not like the radio pop 90s alternative. So
Soundgarden meets Modest Mouse.
Yeah, I guess so. Like it's like a nice happy medium between that. Yeah, but with better vocals.
Okay.
Yeah,
super fun.
Yeah, so good.
I've never heard them before, but I thought I try and pick something that sounded like you described. So
I think it's funny is I think that you would probably I think you would enjoy them because they are so weird that like it's worth just listening to be like, how do they do that? Why would they do that? And their live records are really good. So they have a record called Curse of the Loaf, which is just a great weird live record. It's so cool.
Fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, sweet. That sounds like it's worth checking out.
For sure.
All right. As I said, this episode drops November 2nd, which means that if you haven't already, I am recommending that you go out and vote. Now,
yes,
generally, I will leave it at just vote, but we're in the time of anti-intellectualism, anti-science, and statements of fact and all of that. So I'm actually going to specifically encourage you to go out and vote for any of the candidates who tend to support a more scientific view of the world and who rely on actual objective information and are willing to listen to experts and their expert opinions who have done research on things and know what they're talking about. Those candidates who support science, those are the ones I would encourage you to vote for, because reason in decline is a good way of describing how the world is currently working.
Yes.
But I'd personally be more in support of trying to get back on track with reason in incline.
Yes, please.
That's where I would like us to be. So yes, I'm recommending you go out and vote and support those candidates who are also support a scientific agenda.
100%. I back that recommendation more than my own.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and end it there. As I was mentioning at the beginning of this podcast, if you like what we're up to and would like to support us, one of the ways you can do that for free is leave us a rating and review. You can also, if you'd like to spend a little cash, join us on Patreon. You get to see us shrugging a lot because you get access to videos. You get access to early episodes and all kinds of other bonuses. If you don't want to do that, though, and you'd rather just do a one-time purchase, you can go pick up some merch. We have so much of it, just so much. On our website, there's lots of things for you to order, and you will send you some goodies and all that, and get stickers and beanies and shirts and mugs and water bottles and all kinds of stuff. So you can go check out there. And then just telling a friend about us is a great way to do it as well. Speaking of people who have supported us on Patreon, we have a list, and I like to say thank you because we just really owe them being able to continue to do this show. And that is Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for continuing to support us and what we're up to. And then my team of awesome people, which includes Justin, Selena, Kyle, Alan, Jess, and Patrick. And of course, Shane, thank you so much for recording with me today.
Thanks.
And then always thank you to all of our listeners. If we missed anything about shrugs, or you'd like to tell us about how you use your shrugs or any other ways that you gesture, or you'd like to tell us about your candidates you like to vote for, or 90s alt rock bands who have returned from the grave to release a new album, we love to hear about those things. You can reach us at info@wwd.podcast.com if you'd like to send us a direct email. Of course, you can message us on social media. Have I missed anything, or is there anything to add, Shane?
Nope, I think that covers it.
All right, then. I think that we're done. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.